I am not a pacifist.
And yes, I am a pacifist.
Our country is getting ready to go to war against Iraq as we speak.
It's unthinkable, it's almost unimaginable how much death there is. And we have human rights workers and relief workers who have come there to Iraq from Somalia and other tragic places in the world and said this is the worst Iraq that they've ever seen.
We have the freedom of speech, we have the freedom of thought, and if we think our elected representatives are doing something that's contrary to what we believe in, we have an obligation, indeed a patriotic duty, to speak out even if you're in the minority. I'm Scott Ritter, former Chief Inspector for the United Nations Special Commission, Weapons Inspectors in Iraq. Prior to that, I was an intelligence officer with the United States Marine Corps with service in the former Soviet Union as an arms control inspector and also in Desert Storm in 1991. Today I'm traveling around the country speaking to churches, town hall meetings, universities, colleges, frankly, anybody who's interested in learning more about the situation in Iraq today.
I'm Father Simon Herrick. I'm a Jesuit priest. I was trained in ethics. I have several degrees in ethics. And I've taught in different places around the country, but in 1997 I went to Iraq for the first time and became struck by the suffering of the people there and gradually began to work more and more for them. And by 1999 I had resigned my full professorship at Fairfield University to work full-time for the lifting of the sanctions on the Iraqi people. Recently I was invited to SUNY Oneonta to give a presentation. I was surprised to hear I was also going to be speaking with Scott Ritter. And we ended up coming from different directions but arriving at the same conclusion. And that was wonderful for me and I think very impressive for the audience as well.
I come at this problem from a little bit different perspective than my gracious hosts. I am not a pacifist. I spent 12 years in the Marine Corps studying and perfecting the art of war, and have indeed waged war in the name of my country against our enemies, and would do so again. I believe that there is a time and a place for warfare. Now, after September 11th, the Security Council of the United Nations came together and passed a resolution which recognized that the United States had been attacked, therefore freeing the United States under Article 51 to bring to accountability those who perpetrated the attack. Hence, why the world supports us going into Afghanistan, why the world supports a campaign against Al-Qaeda, why the world supports a campaign against the Taliban. It's legitimate self-defense. It's not pretty, it's not perfect, and I don't agree with everything or even every way it's being conducted, but it's a just war.
I'd like to say that maybe Mr. Ritter and I would want to discuss the criteria for just war when it applies to Afghanistan. I think it's just something that we would probably want to go back and forth on for a while. That's all. Just a reflection as to, for example, yes, the United Nations did agree that the United States had been attacked. They did not, however, authorize the use of force against anybody. That should tell us something. We then went out and used force. Now, if we were so much in keeping with the United Nations resolution, then they would have authorized it. In other words, I'm asking you to do what Mr. Ritter asked you so powerfully to do also with Afghanistan. Let's keep the questioning open here.
And I will tell you that Iraq is governed by one of the most brutal dictators modern times has seen. Saddam Hussein is a very evil man. He has committed horrific crimes on his people and on his neighbors. I'm not here speaking out in defense of Saddam Hussein, but I'm here to tell you that just because Saddam Hussein is a bad and evil man is not just cause for the United States to go to war. And the international community understands this. There's been many efforts to link Iraq to the terrorists. If you recall, immediately after September 11th, there was a lot of talk about Iraqi intelligence operatives flying into Afghanistan and meeting with al-Qaeda, meeting with the Taliban, etc. But as we speak, U.S. Special Forces and intelligence operatives are scouring the caves of Afghanistan, looking through very detailed records of al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and guess what they're not finding? Any record of Iraqi intelligence people going to Afghanistan. Why? No such trip existed. This was the fabrication of certain elements that want to create the aura of legitimacy to go to war against Iraq. But the fact is, Iraq and al-Qaeda were not linked.
Before 1990, before the Gulf War, Iraq, and there's a lot to be said. I mean, and I agree with Mr. Ritter. My goodness, this man, Saddam Hussein, I'm no psychoanalyst, but what are you going to say? He looks pretty sociopathic to me. I mean, I really think that he could, you know, sit down, have a chat with you, blow your brains out, and then go have a beer. I don't think it would bother him, you know. But the other thing that happened at the same time is he's this person who just, well, you know, you disagree with him and you're coming home in a body bag, or two, or three. You just, you know, and while that's happening, also he's overseeing this tremendous social uplift program. You got to say that at the same time. I mean, these people who keep him in power, he's not just... one of the things that they did was reinvest the oil money that they had into education, such that now they, first of all, tried to eliminate illiteracy among women. Illiteracy among women went from 88% to 9%, and that was overseen by Saddam Hussein, of all people. In 6 years, that happened, from 1972 to 1978. And then free education was provided for everybody by the same guy, you know, madman. The same guy. He was providing free education through elementary school, through high school, through college. Hey, all you college guys, free education, and free books too, and free pencils, and want to know something else? Free graduate school. You want to go on to graduate school? You're there. It's free. It's free medical school, it's free law school, it's free, I mean, oil money is big money. That's what they were doing. I also found out that the Iraqis had used their oil money to build up the best healthcare system in the region, and it was free for Iraqis and even for people coming in from outside. It was known that if you had any serious healthcare problems, you would come to Iraq because they had the best technology and the best doctors in the region. By about around 1989, the UN was calling Iraq an emerging first world nation. All the social indicators were so high, an emerging first world nation. I mean, that's how good things were going. All right, then comes the brutal invasion of Kuwait, and of course the response. The war, and we just started to talk to you a little bit about the war and how it attacked, the bombs attacked the infrastructure. And we targeted what's called the infrastructure. That is the electrical system, the water system, the clean water delivery system, the sewage treatment system. 70% of the farms, 80% of the fisheries were bombed. When we took out the electricity in a country that is an emerging first world nation, what collapses, of course, immediately is the healthcare system. So the refrigeration units, you can't have the blood, the drugs are gone. This is in the middle of a war. There are no operations possible. And then what else breaks down is the clean water delivery system and the sewage treatment system. So now you have this poison water running through the streets, coming out of the taps with E. coli and cholera and bacteria of all kinds. And this situation has remained. All right, the Gulf War. But add sanctions to that. What are sanctions? Sanctions fundamentally say that Iraq can't sell its oil, except as pretty much we say so. It's off the market. Now, 95% of Iraq's foreign exchange, that means the stuff it needs to buy, the money it needs to buy things on the open market, came from the sale of oil. Came from the sale of oil. Now Iraq, which still had the sanctions, couldn't purchase replacement parts for its water treatment system, couldn't purchase replacements for the blood and medicines that it had lost, couldn't purchase food. It had imported most of its food, couldn't purchase food. So once you take that 95% purchasing power, international purchasing power, away from a country that you just bombed, and it has no medicines, it has no blood, and it's got dirty water all over it, and then you take away its money so it can't repair, what do you think is going to happen? When I was in University of Notre Dame, I was also teaching ROTC students and had to acquire some knowledge of the ethics of peace and war. And one of the things we studied was siege, which has been an ancient method of warfare, the oldest form of total war, it's called. And we were discussing the ethics of that. Normally, what you're thinking about when you're thinking about war is attacking military people. But a siege does not do that. It's total war, which means it attacks everybody, men, women, children, and if you think about it, think about back to the Middle Ages when they used to surround a city and try to starve them out. It not only attacks the men, the women, and children, it attacks the animals, the vegetables, the minerals, the air, the water, everything that you can do, because the way a siege is constructed is that it is an indirect attack on the military and the government, and a direct attack on the civilian population. Basically, a siege has two reasons. The first is to break the will of the people to resist the besieger. And the second is, indirectly, an attack on the government or military, such that when they look upon all of the civilians who have died as a result of the siege, their will to resist also crumbles, and then they cooperate with the besieger. Okay, what's the bottom line on all this? Death. UNICEF in 1999 went in there in August, well, before that, but in August of 1999, it published a report. It had interviewed 24,000 families, tried to figure out what was going on. And they reported that they estimated that since the sanctions, the death rate among children under the age of 5 had been increased by 500,000. 500,000 children under the age of 5. That's what we're looking at in Iraq. That's just children under the age of 5. I didn't tell you about the 7-year-olds, and I didn't tell you about the 9-year-olds, and the folks who have insulin and need insulin, and the old folks, and the diabetics, and the heart disease. We didn't count those. That's just 500,000 children under the age of 5. Dead.
Now, when we went into Iraq, we did so without guns, without flak vests, without fire support. We went in just as inspectors with fashionable little blue baseball caps and nice little blue passports that we handed over and said, we're inspectors, we're here to do it. What gave us the credibility to confront the Iraqis as decisively as we did? Our adherence to the law. Now, the Iraqis since 1991 tried calling me and my other inspectors CIA operatives. You were American, obviously, you're a former Marine Corps intelligence officer, you must be a CIA agent, they said. Wrong. If I were a CIA agent, you think I would have been able to do my job for 7.5 years with that kind of scrutiny? Never. The reason why I and the other inspectors were able to do our jobs is for the fact that we weren't doing anything illegal. We could stand before the Security Council, and remember, of the 5 permanent members, 3 of them, Russia, France, and China, are not necessarily pro-inspection, and we'd be looking, along with the Iraqis, for any excuse to kick the inspectors out. And yet for 7+ years, we stood before the Security Council and said, you gave us the job, we're doing the job. If you don't like the job we're doing, change the law. But don't ask us to bend the rules, because we're not going to. That's how we stood up to the Iraqis. We said merely, we're doing the job we were told to do. Which is fine and dandy until which time the United States stepped in and sought to manipulate the inspection process. As early as 1992, the United States used information by weapons inspectors. In August of 1992, I headed a weapons inspection team that investigated 2 production facilities south of Baghdad that were involved in nuclear weapons related activity prior to the Gulf War. And the Iraqis were very nervous because I came in and told them that I'm inspecting everything. They said, well, we don't like what you do. I said, you have no option. You don't have an option, so just sit down and shut up. I'm doing my job. Get out of my way. And part of my job was to register every single machine tool they had, by serial number, make and model, and then take a GPS, which is a global satellite positioning system, and record the exact place in the building where it was. Why? So when future inspectors came in, the Iraqis couldn't shuffle this material around. We would monitor it. That was our job. That's what we were allowed to do. And the Iraqis went, you're a fool, Mr. Ritter, because this information that you're using will be used by the United States to bomb Iraq. And they said, it can't, because I represent the United Nations here, and my government has sent me here to obey the law. I promise you that I will protect this information. Well, I did, to the best of my ability. Unfortunately, in January of 1993, 23 cruise missiles came in and clobbered these facilities using The very information, when you looked at the bomb damage photos, you saw that the side of the building that had all the machine tools were where the cruise missiles hit. The cruise missiles came in and hit exactly where we had recorded the most sensitive of the production equipment. Now, as an inspector, I protested vociferously to my government. I'm an American. I love my country more than life itself. I would die for my country. I would put my life on the line for my country, but only when my country is right, only when it's doing the right thing. And here we were violating the law. Because, see, the U.S. became addicted to this intelligence information we were collecting on Saddam Hussein. Suddenly, the U.S. knew where Saddam was spending the night. They knew how his convoys were constructed. They knew how his convoys operated. They had the information needed to take Saddam out. Now, imagine they got this big old gun cocked and ready to fire. They need something to pull the trigger, so they use the weapons inspectors. They create an incident. They send the inspectors in, not to find weapons of mass destruction, but to provoke a deliberate confrontation with the Iraqis that would result in the Iraqis denying the inspectors the ability to do their work. And this occurred in December of 1998, where weapons inspectors went to sites that had nothing to do with biological weapons or chemical weapons. They went to a Ba'ath Party political site in downtown Baghdad. Now, there was this deal we had with the Iraqis that we went to a sensitive site like this, we call it the sensitive site modalities, that we could go in with 4 inspectors. But in order to complicate things, the United States turned to the head of the weapons inspection program, Richard Butler, and said, scrap the deal, without going to the Security Council for permission. Just tell your chief inspector, when he goes to Iraq, we're sending in as many inspectors as we want, the deal be damned. So the inspectors show up and the Iraqis say, come on in, we'll let you in, inspect away. But when we bring up 16 inspectors, they say, hey, time out, we got this deal. You can only bring in 4. If you need more, bring them in, but bring in 4 initially. No, we violated the agreement, and the Iraqis wouldn't let the inspection team in. The inspection team was withdrawn. And now the United States has an excuse. The U.S. picks up the phone, orders all inspectors out of Iraq. See, there's this popular conception that the Iraqis kicked the inspectors out. No, the U.S. ordered the inspectors out. Why? Because 24 hours later, we launched a 72-hour bombing campaign. And guess what we bombed? The first 2 cruise missiles that hit Iraq hit buildings where Saddam Hussein was supposed to be sleeping, not weapons of mass destruction facilities. It was targeted to assassinate Saddam Hussein using the intelligence collected by the weapons inspectors. Of over 120 sites, less than 12 had anything to do with weapons of mass destruction, and every one of those 12 were sites that up to 2 weeks prior to that were under full monitoring by UN weapons inspectors, meaning we knew there was nothing illegal taking place at those sites. Oh, we blew up those 12 factories. Of course, they'd been rebuilt, and now you hear the Bush administration saying the Iraqis have rebuilt destroyed factories, therefore they have valid chemical and biological weapons programs. It's not the case.
You don't produce biological weapons in a basement. You don't produce chemical weapons, in a bathtub. It requires significant infrastructure, and we destroyed this infrastructure. Furthermore, we were monitoring Iraq's industrial infrastructure to ensure not only that they weren't producing weapons of mass destruction, but they also weren't reconstituting the capability that we had eliminated. They haven't had the time, they haven't had the funding, and they haven't had access to the technology required to reconstitute this capability. So I am confident that as we speak today, Iraq does not have a meaningful capability. Well, I think it's absolutely wonderful that the Bush administration is talking about weapons inspections and getting weapons inspectors back in. And it would be wonderful if they were serious about it. Unfortunately, they're not serious about it. The last thing this administration wants is weapons inspectors to go back to Iraq, thereby triggering a process which will ultimately result in the lifting of economic sanctions. Once sanctions are lifted, you guarantee Saddam Hussein's continued survival. U.S. policy isn't about disarming Iraq. Iraq's already been disarmed. The CIA knows it. Everybody in Washington, D.C. knows it. U.S. policy is about the elimination of Saddam Hussein. And right now, the United States has extreme difficulty in building international consensus on this issue. The rest of the world has not lined up behind the concept of removing Saddam. There must be justification. The U.S. tried to link Iraq with the terrorist attack of 9/11. That failed. They tried to link Iraq to the anthrax attacks that followed 9/11. That failed. Right now, the Bush administration is embracing the concept of weapons of mass destruction, pushing the fear factor in the American public by talking about biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons that are in the possession of the Iraqis, although that's a fabrication. We know they don't have the weapons. We know it. We know what they had, we know what we eliminated, we know what their capabilities are. But the fact is, we're pushing the fear factor, selling weapons of mass destruction as justification for not disarming Iraq, but going to war against Iraq, eliminating Saddam Hussein. This is wrong.
Let's get down to what sanctions are about. They were about a way of compelling Saddam Hussein to change his way of thinking. They have failed. Saddam Hussein's there. He's becoming more powerful as they speak. What have sanctions done? Killed millions of people.
In the history of the 20th century, with all the wars that were fought, weapons of mass destruction killed between 300 and 400,000 people. In the 10 years that the United Nations has been involved in weapons inspections in Iraq for the purpose of eliminating Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, the economic sanctions that are used as an inducement for Iraq to disarm have resulted in the deaths of over 1.5 million Iraqis. We've killed 6 times as many Iraqis in pursuit of the elimination of weapons of mass destruction that have been killed in the 20th century with all the wars that mankind had fought using weapons of mass destruction. This includes Hiroshima, Nagasaki, all the chemical deaths from World War I, the use of Iraqi and Iranian chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq War, all of it together. The use of weapons of mass destruction compared to the amount of Iraqis killed trying to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. There's an imbalance here. There's something fundamentally wrong with what's taking place. But even if the policy isn't weapons of mass destruction, and let's say we endorse the policy of getting rid of Saddam Hussein, going after one man, we claim we want to get rid of Saddam Hussein to better the life of the Iraqi people. And yet, the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq for the purposes of isolating this brutal dictator, of compelling him to change his policies, has not resulted in an isolation of him paying a price. Saddam lives. He lives in palaces. I've been in the palaces. They're opulent. He doesn't suffer. His inner circle doesn't suffer. Those who are closest to him don't suffer. The people of Iraq suffer. A nation of 20 million people has lost 1.5 million deaths in the last 10 years out of our efforts to remove Saddam. And if we follow through with this military campaign, hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, will suffer, either as a direct result of the war or in the horrific, implosion of Iraq's civil society that will follow. What are we trying to accomplish here?
I believe that one of the reasons that the United States is contemplating the invasion of Iraq is because it senses that its sanctions policy is failing, is crumbling. But we have to understand that the goal of the sanctions policy is really control of the Iraqi oil. That's what we're afraid of losing. There is a certain amount of smuggling that goes on, and so we hear about that. There's certain blockade running, and that's always been true. Whenever there's a blockade, there's going to be blockade running, and that's happening in Iraq. You cannot run an entire nation's economy on that kind of smuggling, so we're safe as far as that's concerned. And the sanctions make sure that Iraq doesn't get a chance to repair its oil production facilities sufficient to make itself independent. So in order for Iraq, to get an economy back that runs, they're going to have to repair the oil production facilities and have control of their own oil. That's what we want to prevent. Because if Iraq gets control of the second largest oil reserves in the world, which is what it has, then it becomes a power in that area, and that's something that we want to prevent. So the invasion, I'm not sure, Scott might say it has a lot to do with Saddam Hussein, and he could be right. But I believe it has more to do with control of the oil in the region, and that whoever we put in there or don't put in there has to give us access to that Iraqi oil, otherwise we wouldn't care who runs that country.
What are we trying to do? When you present this to a congressman, when you present this argument to a senator, they agree. It makes no sense. And yet they're powerless to do anything politically to oppose the single-minded pursuit of Saddam Hussein, because the poll numbers indicate that the American public has bought off on the demonization of Saddam, on the fact that Iraq represents a true risk to our national security, and that to solve this, Saddam must be eliminated.
latest U.S.-led UN initiative on the sanctions is called the Smart Sanctions, and we advertise them as bringing more consumer goods to the Iraqi people, supposedly relieving their suffering. Well, there may be some more consumer goods coming in, but we have a 300 and some odd page list of dual-use items, some of which are regular stuff that folks would need, but they could possibly be used for weapons, so they're forbidden. The stuff that isn't on that list still has to go through a long process of approval, although it's not through the Sanctions Committee. Now, once the stuff does get through, if it ever manages to get through and get on the shelves somehow, well, you're walking along with your little kid and she wants an orange, but you don't have any money to buy it. So there's the stuff on the shelf. You don't have any money to buy it. Your kid is still hungry. It makes it really worse than it was before. I think the big thing to remember is that this one program is never meant to replace the entire economy of Iraq. And that's what the sanctions have paralyzed, the entire economy of Iraq. And that has drawn worldwide criticism on the United States for its insistence on this sanction. And so it looks as though this program is there to deflect that worldwide criticism somehow back onto the Iraqi government. Oh, look, we gave them this stuff. They're not distributing it. The people are continuing to suffer and die. So it must be the fault of the Iraqi government and not the sanctions themselves. Then this gives us a further reason for this invasion, which will cause untold suffering and death in Iraq, more even than the sanctions have caused already.
So what needs to happen is there must be some movement at the grassroots level to reverse these poll figures. We got to get the American public educated as to the reality of the situation in Iraq, that Saddam Hussein, while he is a dictator, does not pose a threat to the American public, that the international community does have a sound and logical way of dealing with Iraq, and that is the return of weapons inspectors, the institution of a process that guarantees Iraq will never again reconstitute its weapons of mass destruction programs, the lifting of economic sanctions, the bettering of the humanitarian situation in Iraq, the engendering of stability in the Middle East, thereby the rest of the world, and the bettering of life for the United States.
One of the things that I think anybody who visits Iraq, any American who visits Iraq, is astonished at is the welcome, the level of welcome that we receive as Americans from the Iraqi people. Well, they honestly believe that this is the fault of our government, but not of us as a people, and they love us as a people. And maybe the concrete proof of that is that for 11 years, we've killed a minimum of 500,000 of their children under the age of 5, and they have not struck us. There's been no suicide bombing. There's been no chemical or biological warfare attacks from Iraqis, even after we've been doing this to them for 11 years. It's remarkable, the forbearance and the forgiveness of these people. On the other hand, I once went into a school where the children were so frightened of Americans that one of them actually suffered a seizure. Many of them had to be taken home because they've been growing up all of their lives with American bombing and American jet planes breaking the sound barrier over them, and of course the sanctions. And the hatred is born of that fear. If you grow up with that kind of fear, what are you going to turn into after 10, 15, 20 years? That's what we have to be afraid of.
It comes down to the system, the democratic system. You, the constituency, have got to convince your elected representative that not only won't you hold him accountable for doing the right thing on Iraq, you're going to hold him accountable if he continues to push, he or she continues to push the current policy. It's going to require a concerted effort. It's going to require, former Marines getting together with, you see, it's almost an impossible thing. but getting together with pacifists. It's going to require Democrats and Republicans. And the bottom line, it's going to require an American effort. And that's the only way we're going to succeed. But there is not, as we speak, a hardcore constituency in Congress, in the Senate, that's willing to do the right thing about Iraq. It doesn't exist, and it's going to be very, very difficult to make it exist. But one of the elements of making it come together is you, the electorate. Do the right thing. Become informed. Challenge your elected representatives, and maybe we can get a policy that makes sense for America, for the world, for the people of Iraq.